It was 2 weeks to Christmas, and Mr. Ade's house was filled with noise. The children were running up and down, excited about their trip to a duecity. They had no idea of the evil that awaited them. This wasn't their first time traveling for Christmas. Every year they went to the village, the only time they saw their extended family. The children loved it, the fresh air, big trees, and cousins to play with. But this year, everything was about to change in a terrible and tragic way. Mr. Ade's wife, Ronk, was busy packing clothes and cooking snacks for the journey. She always prepared everything days ahead, ensuring nothing was forgotten. But there was one thing that always worried her. Mr. Ade never prayed. "Ade, please let's pray for just 2 minutes," she said as she folded clothes into a bag. Mr. Ade waved his hand like he was chasing a fly. "Ronk, stop disturbing me. God knows I'm traveling. He doesn't need me to remind him to protect us," he said, laughing. Ronk's heart felt heavy. She looked at her husband and shook her head. "Why won't you understand?" she whispered to herself. The children weren't any better. The older ones had started copying their father. When Ronk knelt to pray in the morning, they grumbled, dragging their feet. "Mama, why do we have to pray every day? It's boring." But Ronk didn't stop praying, even when they made faces at her. She always prayed for her family, asking God to protect them. But deep in her heart, she wished her husband would join her, even just once. The house was full of laughter and excitement as the children talked about all the fun they would have in the village. Mr. Ade smiled at their joy, but Ronk sat quietly, watching her family. She held her breath and prayed silently. "Lord, keep us safe this Christmas." As the days to Christmas grew closer, the family didn't know that something was waiting for them on the road ahead, something that would test their faith and change their lives forever. One evening, Mr. Ade was driving home from work, his mind on the journey ahead. As he turned a corner, he saw an old woman standing by the roadside, waving for help. Her wrapper was tied tightly around her waist, and she carried a small basket in her hand. Mr. Ade slowed down and stopped beside her. "Mama, where are you going?" he asked, leaning out of the window. The old woman's voice was tired. "My son, I'm going down the next street. Can you take me there?" Mr. Ade nodded. "Get in, Mama." The old woman climbed into the car, settling herself quietly. They drove in silence, the only sound coming from the engine and the faint chirping of crickets outside. Then the old woman cleared her throat. "My son, I hope you won't be angry with what I'm about to say." Mr. Ade glanced at her, curious. "What is it, Mama?" She took a deep breath. "This Christmas, you should not travel to your village. And if you must go, you and your family must pray and fast before the journey. There is danger ahead." Her words hung in the air like smoke. Mr. Ade laughed loudly, shaking his head. "Mama, you want me to cancel my family's trip? This is not the first time I'm traveling for Christmas. Nothing will happen." The old woman's eyes were dark and serious. "I've said what I came to say. The rest is up to you, my son." When they reached her destination, the old woman got out and turned to him one last time. "Thank you for the ride. Remember my words. Pray and fast if you must go." Mr. Ade waved her off, smiling. "Thank you, Mama. Take care." As he drove away, he thought to himself, why do people like to scare others with these stories? He convinced himself that she was just being superstitious. After all, he had made this trip many times before, and nothing had ever happened. But as his car disappeared into the evening, the old woman stood still, watching. Her face was unreadable. Her words had been spoken, but what lay ahead was no longer in her hands. It was 2 days to Christmas, and the house was buzzing with excitement. Bags were packed and stacked by the door, filled with clothes, gifts, and snacks. The children danced around, excited to see their cousins. Ronk, as always, was the calm one. Before they left, she called everyone to the living room. "Let's pray before we go," she said, her voice gentle but firm. Mr. Ade frowned. "Ronk, what is it with you and prayers? We're not going to the moon, it's just the village. Let me go and warm the car," he said, waving her off. Ronk sighed and knelt to pray alone with the children. Outside, Mr. Ade got into the driver's seat, turned the ignition key, and waited. But instead of the usual hum of the engine, there was silence. He tried again. The car coughed weakly but refused to start. "What is this now?" Mr. Ade muttered. He got out, opened the bonnet, and stared at the engine as if it would explain itself. Still the car wouldn't start. Frustrated, he went back inside. "Ronk, the car won't start." "I don't know what's wrong with it," he said, scratching his head. Ronk looked at him, calm as ever. "Maybe God doesn't want us to go," she said softly. Mr. Ade snapped. "Stop saying that. What does God have to do with a car engine? I'll call the mechanic." The mechanic came quickly. After a few minutes, he stood up and shook his head. "Olga, the engine has knocked. This car isn't going anywhere until it's fixed." Mr. Ade's mouth fell open. "Knocked? How? I drove this car yesterday, and it was fine." The mechanic shrugged. "Sometimes these things just happen, sir." Ronk smiled faintly. God knows why. But Mr. Ade wouldn't hear it. "So what now? Are we just going to stay here and cancel Christmas?" Ronk said nothing. She only watched as her husband paced like a restless lion. After a while, Mr. Ade clapped his hands. "We'll go to the park and take a commercial bus. It's not ideal, but we'll still get to the village." Ronk frowned. "Maybe we shouldn't go at all," she said gently. "Don't start again, Ronk." Mr. Ade snapped. "I've made up my mind." And with that, the matter was settled. But what Mr. Ade and his family didn't know was that not everyone was happy about their yearly Christmas visits. Far away in a duecity, Mama Funk sat outside her mud house, her heart boiling with jealousy. "Why must every Christmas be about Ade?" she muttered bitterly. She made up her mind. This year would be different. And so began the plan to stop Ade's family from reaching the village alive. Mama Funk's heart burned with envy. Every year Mr. Ade and his family arrived like royalty, their shiny car drawing all eyes. His wife, Ronk, and their children looked well-fed and happy, while her own children struggled to survive. Her 4 sons could barely afford to return home. When they did, it was on old bicycles or on foot. Mama Funk clenched her fists. This Christmas, that boy and his family will not come here to show off. She called for her closest friend, Mama Beezy. "Sister," she said in a low voice, "I cannot take it anymore. This year, Ade and his family must not come to overshadow my sons." Mama Beezy, whose tongue was sharper than a knife, nodded. "You are right, Funk. It's time you did something about it." Without wasting time, the 2 women went deep into the forest, where the village witches lived. The path was dark, the trees bending low as if they were listening. When they reached the witch's hut, a cold wind blew through, sending chills down their spines. An old woman, her face as wrinkled as a dry leaf, greeted them. "Why have you come?" Her voice echoed like thunder. Mama Funk knelt on the ground, her head bowed. "I need your help. My stepson Ade must not reach this village alive. His success has shamed me and my children for too long." The witches laughed, their cackles sharp as breaking glass. "Is that all?" the leader asked, her eyes glowing. "Consider it done." They gathered around a pot bubbling with thick, black liquid. One of the witches threw in a piece of cloth. Mama Funk had kept a piece of Ade's shirt from his last visit. Another added ashes, muttering strange incantations. The leader raised her hand, and the room went silent. "They will not reach this village alive," she declared. "A deadly accident awaits them on the road." Mama Funk's heart swelled with dark joy. She handed over some coins as payment, and the witches laughed as they prepared the final curse. "It is done," the leader said, her voice cold as stone. That night, Mama Funk returned home, her face calm but her heart dancing. She could already see it, Ade's car smashed, his family gone, the villagers mourning. "Finally, there will be no one to overshadow my sons," she whispered. Back in the city, the morning of the journey arrived. At the bus park, the air buzzed with excitement. Vendors shouted, selling bread, sachet water, and roasted corn. Travelers hurried around, dragging bags and calling out to their children. Mr. Ade led his family to a bus. It wasn't as comfortable as their car, but it would get them to the village. As they settled into their seats, Ronk's voice broke the chatter. "Let us pray before the journey begins," she said, standing up and looking at the passengers. Some people nodded and closed their eyes. Others ignored her, whispering among themselves. Mr. Ade's face turned red with embarrassment. "Ronk, sit down," he hissed. "You're embarrassing me. This is public transport, not church." But Ronk didn't listen. She closed her eyes, her voice firm and steady. "Lord, protect us on this journey. Cover this bus and everyone inside it. Amen." Some passengers mumbled amen, while others rolled their eyes. Mr. Ade shook his head, muttering, "She will never change." The bus roared to life, pulling out of the park. The city gradually faded into the distance. The children chattered and laughed, pointing at sights along the road. Mr. Ade, feeling the gentle sway of the bus, dozed off, his head resting against the window. For a while everything was peaceful. The road stretched ahead, the hum of the engine filling the air. But then everything changed. The driver's shaky voice broke the silence. The brakes are not working." His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. Panic erupted in the bus. Passengers screamed as the bus swerved uncontrollably, veering from one side of the road to the other. Ronk held her children close, her lips moving in silent prayer. Ahead, a tanker truck loomed, its massive size filling the road. The driver struggled to control the bus, but it was no use. The bus raced toward the tanker, the sound of screeching tires and terrified screams filling the air. In those moments, time seemed to slow. Ronk's voice rose above the chaos. "Lord, save us." And then, with a deafening crash, the bus collided with the tanker. Metal crunched. Glass shattered. The world went silent. Far away, in a duecity, the wind carried the news of the accident. Whispers spread through the village. "Did you hear? Ade and his family were in a terrible accident." Mama Funk heard the news too. She fell to the ground, wailing loudly, her wrapper flying as she beat her chest. "Oh, my son, my stepchildren, what have we done to deserve this?" she cried. But deep inside, a wicked joy danced in her heart. She thought her plan had worked. "Now, no one will come and overshadow my sons," she told herself. Her tears were nothing but a mask. At the crash site, help finally arrived. Among the wreckage, Ronk and her children were found, shaken but untouched. Not a single bruise or scratch marked their skin. It was as if an invisible hand had shielded them from harm. But Mr. Ade was not so lucky. He had been sitting in the front seat. The force of the collision had crushed his legs. He was alive, but his legs were gone. Rescuers rushed him to the hospital, his family following close behind. Their hearts were heavy, but grateful he was still breathing. Late that evening, the old woman Mr. Ade had given a ride to walked into the hospital room. She stood by his bedside, her eyes full of knowing. "Do you remember me?" she asked. Mr. Ade nodded weakly. "Yes, Mama." She sat down and began to speak. "I told you not to go to the village. I warned you to pray and fast. But you did not listen." She shook her head, her voice soft but firm. "If not for your wife's prayers, you and your children would be gone by now." Tears filled Mr. Ade's eyes. He looked at Ronk, who stood silently, hands clasped together. From that day Mr. Ade changed. He became a man of prayer. And he never returned to the village for Christmas again. The days that followed the accident were filled with pain, reflection, and transformation. Mr. Ade lay in his hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind heavy with regret. His once strong, proud legs were now gone, and his independence had been stripped away in a single moment. But what hurt him the most wasn't the physical pain. It was the realization that he had ignored every warning. He had refused to pray. He had laughed at his wife's faith. He had ignored the old woman's warning. Now he was paying the price. Ronk never left his side. She fed him, helped him sit up, and prayed over him every day. She never said, "I told you so." She didn't need to. He already knew. One evening, as a cool breeze drifted through the hospital window, Mr. Ade reached for Ronk's hand. "Ronk, I have been a foolish man," he whispered. Ronk looked at him with gentle eyes. "Ade, the important thing is that you're alive." "We are alive. God saved us," she said. Mr. Ade nodded slowly, tears filling his eyes. "I never prayed. I never believed. But now I see. If not for your prayers, we would all be dead." Ronk squeezed his hand, her voice full of love. "It's never too late to turn to God, Ade. He saved you for a reason." In that moment Mr. Ade made a vow. He would never neglect prayer again. Back in Aduekiti, Mama Funk's world began to crumble. News spread through the village that Mr. Ade and his family had survived. When she heard it, her chest tightened with fear. "How? The witches said they wouldn't make it," she muttered. She paced her small hut, her heart pounding. Mama Beezy rushed into the room, her face pale with shock. "Funk, have you heard? They survived. The only one injured was Mr. Ade, and even he is still alive." Mama Funk stumbled back, her hands trembling. "It's impossible, the witches assured me." Mama Beezy cut her off, shaking her head. "You played with fire, Funk. But God fought for them. You have failed." At that moment, a sudden wind rushed through the hut, knocking down a clay pot on the shelf. The two women froze. It was a warning. Mama Funk collapsed onto the floor, her body shaking. She had gone too far. And now, she would suffer the consequences. Meanwhile, at the hospital, the old woman returned once again. This time she spoke directly to Ronk. "My daughter, you have saved your family through your prayers. But your battle is not yet over. Your husband must stand strong in faith, or the enemy will try again." Ronk nodded, listening intently. "I understand, Mama. I will not stop praying." The old woman smiled gently, resting a wrinkled hand on Ronk's shoulder. "God has placed you as a pillar in this family. Stand firm. And remember, the wicked never go unpunished." With that, the old woman turned and left, disappearing into the night like a shadow. Days turned into weeks. Mr. Ade slowly healed, adjusting to his new life without legs. But he was no longer the same man. Every morning, he was the first to call his family together for prayer. Every Sunday he was the loudest in church, singing and praising God. His children, who once grumbled about prayers, now prayed willingly. And Ronk. She watched her family transform before her eyes, her heart full of gratitude. She had never given up on them. And now God had rewarded her faith. Years later, Mr. Ade never returned to Aduekiti for Christmas. The memory of the accident, and the betrayal of his stepmother, haunted him. But one day, long after Mama Funk passed away, he finally made the journey back. This time he arrived not in pride, but in humility. No flashy car, no big show. Just a man who had seen the power of God firsthand. The villagers gathered around, whispering, "Is that not Ade? The one who was supposed to die years ago? They say his wife's prayers saved him. God is truly great." As Mr. Ade looked around the village, he felt no anger, no hatred, only peace. He had learned his lesson. Not everyone rejoices in your success. But prayer can protect you from unseen dangers. And so, with a grateful heart, he turned to his wife and whispered, "Ronk, thank you for never giving up on me." Ronk smiled, her eyes shining with love. "I knew God would finish what he started." And with that, they walked into their future, stronger, wiser, and forever changed. Mr. Ade's life took a new shape. Though he had lost his legs, he had gained something far more valuable, faith. He no longer dismissed the power of prayer, nor did he take his wife's devotion for granted. Every morning before the sun rose, his voice would ring through the house, calling his family for devotion. The same children who once grumbled and dragged their feet now woke up willingly, kneeling beside their mother. His transformation was undeniable. Ronk watched in quiet amazement. She had spent years begging and pleading with him to pray, yet nothing had changed him. But now, a single tragedy had done what all her words could not. She knew that while the accident had cost them much, it had saved something even greater: their spiritual lives. One Sunday morning after church, Mr. Ade sat with Ronk in their small living room. He held her hands, looking into her eyes with a sincerity she hadn't seen in years. "Ronk, you are the strongest woman I have ever known," he said. "I wish I had listened to you earlier. I was stubborn. I was blind." She smiled softly, squeezing his hands. "The past doesn't matter anymore, Ade. God has given us another chance." He sighed, shaking his head. "But I was a fool. I allowed pride to blind me. I ignored every warning, and because of my foolishness, I almost destroyed our family. If not for your prayers, we wouldn't be sitting here today." Ronk saw the regret in his eyes, but she also saw something else: peace. He had accepted what had happened. He had learned his lesson. "What matters is that you are here now," she said gently. "And I know that God still has great plans for you." Mr. Ade smiled at her, nodding. "Yes, he does. And from now on, I will live for him." The change in him was not just spiritual, it was also emotional. He became a more present father, listening to his children with a patience he had never shown before. He laughed more, he loved deeper, and he prayed harder. The man who once dismissed the power of prayer was now the one leading it. Even as he adjusted to life without his legs, he refused to let it define him. He found new ways to contribute to his family, taking up work he could do from home. He became more involved in his children's lives, guiding them with wisdom he had once ignored. As for the village, the whispers never truly died down. The story of Mr. Ade's miraculous survival spread far beyond Aduekiti. People spoke in hushed tones, shaking their heads in amazement. "The witches planned his death, but God saved him," they said. "He should have died, but his wife's prayers built a shield around him." The wicked may plan, but God's power is greater. Even the witches in the forest were not untouched by the consequences of their actions. Stories spread of strange occurrences: fires that would not burn, rivers that dried overnight, shadows that moved on their own. The villagers feared that a force greater than their own had intervened. Some of the witches fled, never to be seen again. As for Mama Funk, the weight of her deeds never left her. The shame of her failed plan clung to her like a curse. The villagers never openly accused her, but their eyes spoke volumes. They knew. They all knew. One by one, her sons stopped coming home for Christmas. They distanced themselves from her, ashamed of what she had done. She spent the last years of her life in isolation, haunted by the knowledge that she had invited darkness upon herself. She had wanted to destroy Mr. Ade's life, but in the end, she had destroyed her own. Years later, after Mama Funk passed, Mr. Ade finally made the journey back to Aduekiti. But this time, there was no arrogance in his steps, no pride in his heart. He walked, or rather was wheeled in, with humility. He no longer came as the rich man who overshadowed others, but as a man who had seen God's power firsthand. The villagers who once watched him with envy, now looked at him with reverence. They saw not a man who flaunted his success, but a man who had been broken and rebuilt by God. Standing before the small house where he had spent his childhood, he turned to Ronk. "I never thought I would come back here again," he admitted. She smiled at him, her eyes filled with warmth. "And yet here you are. And this time there is no fear. Only gratitude." He nodded, taking a deep breath. "Yes, gratitude." From that day forward, Mr. Ade dedicated his life to sharing his story. He spoke in churches, in gatherings, anywhere people would listen. He told them of the dangers of pride, of the unseen battles that rage around us, and most importantly, of the power of prayer. His testimony touched many lives. People who had once doubted now believed. Husbands who had dismissed their wives' prayers began to listen. Families that had been torn apart found their way back to each other. His pain had birth purpose. And so, the man who had once scoffed at prayer became a living testimony of its power. Because in the end, not everyone will rejoice in your success. But when you are covered in prayer, no force, seen or unseen, can bring you down. The years rolled by, and Mr. Aid's story became one that many shared, a lesson passed from lips to ears across villages, towns, and churches. The man who once laughed at prayer now lived as proof of its power. His life had changed in ways he never imagined. Losing his legs could have broken him, but instead it built him into something new. His dependence on God became unshakable, and his love for his family deepened. The man who once mocked prayer now led his household in daily worship, guiding his children in the way they should go. Ronk, his wife, became his pillar of strength. Through her unwavering faith and patience, she helped him navigate life without his legs. And although he couldn't walk, he moved mountains in the lives of those around him. He started speaking at gatherings, sharing his testimony in churches, conferences, and schools. Everywhere he went, people listened, their hearts moved by his story. Some husbands who once ignored their wives' prayers began to sit beside them during morning devotions. Some young men, full of arrogance, were humbled by his words and began seeking God for themselves. His story became a powerful reminder. Not everyone who smiles at you wishes you well, and not every family member is truly family. One day, after speaking at a church in another town, a man approached him. He was middle-aged, his face lined with hardship, his eyes filled with tears. "Sir," the man said, kneeling before him, "I need your prayers." Mr. Ade was surprised. "My brother, get up. What is the problem?" The man hesitated before speaking. "My wife is just like your own. She prays all the time, but I always dismissed it. I thought she was being over-religious. But your story..." He wiped his eyes. "Your story has opened my eyes. I don't want to wait until tragedy strikes before I listen to my wife's prayers. Please help me pray that God will forgive me." Mr. Aid's heart swelled. This was the reason he had survived. God had kept him alive so that his story could save others. With tears in his eyes, he reached out his hands, and together they prayed. Word of Mr. Aid's testimony spread like wildfire. Invitations poured in from all over the country. Pastors called, community leaders invited him, and even radio stations wanted to hear his story. He became a man on a mission, using his voice to warn others never to take prayer lightly. But even as he flourished spiritually, his past continued to cast a long shadow over his family. Despite the passage of time, Ronk could never forget the betrayal of Mama Funk. The woman had tried to kill her husband and children out of jealousy. It was a wound that ran deep, and though she had forgiven her in her heart, the pain still lingered. One evening, while sitting on the veranda with Mr. Ade, she sighed deeply. "Ade, have you truly forgiven your stepmother?" He looked at her, understanding in his eyes. "Yes, Ronk, I have. Holding on to hate will not change what happened. God kept us, and that is enough for me." She nodded slowly. "But do you ever wonder, what if she had succeeded?" He reached for her hand. "Then I wouldn't be here today." But she failed Ronk. And more importantly, she lost everything. She spent her last days in shame, and her own children abandoned her. That was her punishment. Ronk sighed, but she said nothing more. Deep down she knew he was right. Some battles did not need to be fought. God had already fought for them. Many years passed, and life continued. Mr. Aid's children grew into adults, each of them carrying the lessons they had learned from their father's experience. The oldest, now a man, became a pastor, dedicating his life to teaching people about faith and the power of prayer. His younger siblings also found success in different ways, but no matter how far they went, they never forgot their mother's prayers or their father's story. One day, Mr. Ade received an invitation to return to a duecity. It had been decades since he had stepped foot in the village, but the elders had called for him. The people wanted to honor him for his wisdom and for all he had done to help others. First he hesitated. The memories of that place were painful. But after praying about it, he knew what he had to do. When he and Ronk arrived, they were welcomed with songs and dancing. The village had changed, yet the people still remembered what had happened. They surrounded him, eager to hear his words. A young man stepped forward, bowing respectfully. "Baba Ade, you are a legend in this village. My own father tells me that you survived what no one should have survived." Mr. Ade smiled. "It was not me. It was God." The elders of the village called him into the main square, where they presented him with a special title, a mark of respect for his resilience and wisdom. But the most shocking moment came later that evening when an elderly woman approached him. She was frail, her hair thin and white, her back bent with age. But her face was familiar. "Mama Beezy," Mr. Ade said in shock. She nodded slowly. "Yes, it is me." She looked at him for a long moment before lowering her head in shame. "I was part of it," she confessed. "I followed Mama Funk into the forest. I was there when the curse was cast against you. But you survived. You thrive. And I." She sighed deeply. "I have lived in regret ever since." Mr. Ade studied the woman before him. She had once plotted his death, but now she was nothing more than an old woman filled with remorse. "You plotted evil against me," he said, his voice calm. "Yet here you are still alive. Tell me why." She wiped her eyes. "Because God is merciful. I repented long ago, but I needed to see you. I needed to say I'm sorry." A long silence followed. Then, to everyone's surprise, Mr. Ade did something unexpected. He stretched out his hand. "You are forgiven, Mama Beezy." The old woman sobbed as she held his hands, her frail body shaking with emotion. She had carried the guilt for too long, and now at last she was free. Ronk watched the scene unfold, and for the first time she felt peace. She had spent years resenting these people, but in that moment she understood something powerful. Forgiveness was not for the other person. It was for yourself. As they left the village the next day, Mr. Ade turned to his wife. "I think we were meant to come back here," he said. Ronk nodded. "Yes, I think so too." And as their car drove away, leaving the past behind, they both knew one thing for certain. God had always been in control. Because no matter how much evil was planned against them, prayer had built a shield around their family. And nothing could break what God had already protected.